Welcome back everyone to our studies of AQA A-level history. We're continuing talking about reform and challenge between 1851 and 1886, and we're going to think about in this lesson the idea of society and social changes. Now specifically, we're going to explore the nature of society and social changes, of course, thinking about class and regional divisions, and the idea of prosperity and poverty. Now, a relatively broad and open-ended collection of things that we can examine here, but generally we will spend half of our lesson talking about class and regional division, and then we will spend the other half of the lesson thinking about prosperity and poverty. That's essentially what we will think about. Now, probably the most important and most prominent event which takes place during this period is the continuation of the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of industrial cities gives rise to the new social class, an industrial middle class, as well as the development of new social and political movements, all become key features of British society during this time. And so when we look at class and regional divisions, we see that rapid industrialization gives rise to rapid urbanization. We see that essentially people move from the rural countryside into the cities, and these cities continue to grow. These industrial cities begin to grow as people find more and more work in these new industrial places, in these new industries. And so rapid industrialization leads to rapid urbanization, which creates a significant amount of class division that is deeply embedded within the structure of society. The traditional class system, then, of the early 19th century undergoes significant transformations, and new forms of social stratification begins to emerge, and greater distinctions between wealth and poverty begins to exist as well. So the first point to make very clear is the rise of this new industrial middle class. The expansion of industry led to the growth of a new class. We sometimes describe this as the industrial middle class or the industrial bourgeoisie, and these were composed of factory owners, of merchants, of bankers, of managers, all who accumulated wealth not through the ownership of land necessarily, or even through aristocracy, as other middle class or upper class people would have accumulated wealth, or through a profession like being a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, like other parts of the middle class, but they accumulated wealth through the development of industries, trade, and financial enterprises, through ownership of the means of production that they can then extract the labor value of their workers, if we're taking a Marxist analysis of this kind of process. So by the mid-19th century, the industrial middle class had become an increasingly powerful force within Britain, particularly, as you would probably imagine, within these urban centres. We see that many of these entrepreneurs, the idea of the entrepreneur and the capitalist, they came from small landowning or even trading backgrounds. But as industrialization progressed, they would begin to amass significant amounts of wealth and political influence. They would advocate for things like free trade and capitalist economics, because that would, of course, necessarily benefit their position and benefit their ability to create and further their own wealth ambitions. Political reforms that would benefit their own commercial interests were also advocated for by this new class of individuals. But alongside the industrial capitalists or the entrepreneurial class, you had the rise of new professions, the lawyers, the doctors, the engineers, and the accountants, who not only existed prior to this period of time, but would also grow because of the new influence that this new industrial revolution might bring. With the new industrial revolution, engineers and professionals who work in the creation of new industries also began to become more prevalent. Lawyers and accountants who would deal with these different kinds of business structures, again, would also become more and more prevalent. These professional classes were often educated in universities and would begin to form a backbone of a new educated elite, which would further reshape social hierarchy. When we think about the working class was largely composed of industrial workers, and it was probably one of the most important classes that was most affected by the social changes of the mid-19th century. With essentially the rise of mines and factories, we see the provision of employment for large segments of the population, particularly in urban environments. Factory workers, for example, would operate in cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, and would be labouring under quite hazardous conditions, often working between 12 and 16 hours per day for very low wages. These workers lived in poor, overcrowded housing, as we could see that essentially the growth of the cities as people came in could not necessarily account for these new workers. So the city tried to grow as more people came in, but it would lead to an overcrowding because they were the rate of the population increase was not being kept up by the rate of expansion of new housing, of new industrial working conditions, essentially. So we see that there's overcrowded housing in these growing industrial towns, and that they were subjected to the authority of factory owners, who would, of course, prioritize profit over worker welfare. This is something that is not particularly controversial. In some sectors of the working class, particularly skilled artisans, so people like carpenters and blacksmiths and weavers, would enjoy slightly better living conditions and wages. However, with industrialization, many of these skilled jobs would become replaced by mechanization, machine-based production, which would lead to the growing unemployment and the decline of the artisan status as industrial labor instead took over traditional work. Why would you hire a blacksmith or a carpenter to do the work that a machine can do when you can just hire, instead of hiring 10 carpenters, for example, you could just hire one industrial worker who knows how to operate a machine that can do what 10 carpenters already know how, that would be able to do all at once. So essentially you are increasing or decreasing, should I say, the amount you have to pay someone by 10 times because you only have to pay one person. Industrialization also led to widespread employment, quite interestingly, of women and children into these factories. While many worked in often domestic service areas, like working as domestic servants or potentially in textile mills, they were often, again, subject to harsh working conditions, and as female emancipation was still nowhere near the kind of levels that we will start to see later on in the early 20th century, they were paid significantly less than that of men. Child labour would be common in these industries, such as in coal mining and textiles, and children again would often have to work long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. In terms of the upper classes within society, we can see that while the Industrial Revolution did create an immense amount of wealth for the bourgeois class, this new industrial bourgeois, the traditional aristocracy and what we would describe as the landed gentry continued to hold significant power, not only economic power, but also political power. Now, this is the case despite the fact that their economic and their social positions begins to shift as industrial wealth becomes more important than land ownership, because industry begins to grow at a faster and faster rate as the result of the Industrial Revolution. And so this idea of the old aristocracy, the British aristocracy, composed of the wealthy landowners, maintained a certain amount of social prestige and political influence and substantial property holdings, and their wealth and influence of this landed elite began to erode, however, as industrialists outpaced them in terms of wealth. But the point of this particular point on the slide here is that even though relative to the new industrial class that is beginning to take over, their wealth was beginning to get outpaced, they still dominated much of the political scene, and land ownership was still a very important part of the political process. The traditional gentry, the landed gentry, those who held land and often had strong connections to the rural economy, would still play a central role in local governance and the social fabric of the countryside. Yet they were also increasingly becoming overshadowed by the economic power of the industrialists. the sort of status quo of the landed gentry and the old aristocracy was being replaced by this idea of a new industrial revolution, when this new economic powerhouse enters onto the market and enters into the workforce and creates quite a lot of disruption in terms of the social, economic, and to a lesser extent the political conditions of the time. Now, despite their reduced economic role, the aristocracy would continue to maintain not necessarily economic dominance, but instead cultural dominance through their control of various different things, such as the institutions like the Church of England, or they would just hold often very prominent positions in political institutions, particularly the House of Lords. We'll get to House of Lords reform later on in this series. So we can see that class division is very clearly being expressed as the result of the Industrial Revolution, that there's essentially a major shake-up taking place within the social fabric of Great Britain at the time, and we can see that class is beginning to divide not only between the aristocracy, the traditional aristocracy on the one hand, and also the landed gentry on the other, but also this growing industrial class. In addition to this, the social structure of Britain was also deeply shaped by regional divisions. Often, the most prevalent dichotomy that we see is the division between the urban centres on the one hand and the countryside on the other, urban versus rural. This is something that we see across all of geography, essentially, when thinking about social changes. So cities in the north and the Midlands of England, such as Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds and Derby, were all the heart of the industrial British economy at this point. These cities saw massive population growth as people would migrate from the rural areas to work in factories and mines to try and find better working conditions or better wages than they were having in these rural countrysides. This urbanization, however, led to serious social challenges. We know already, and have mentioned previously, that there was overcrowding, there was poor sanitation, and there was the development of slums in these different cities. This is the result of a massive influx of population into a city that cannot account for this massive influx in population. Cities can only grow at a certain rate, a certain pace. We can only build houses and buildings and housing for all these people at a certain rate. And so if the influx of people coming into these cities trying to find industrial work outpaces the speed at which these cities can grow and house these individuals, then you're going to end up with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the development of these slums. By contrast then, the south and the southeast of England, we see agriculture remaining a dominant economic activity. These were, of course, more rural and agrarian parts of Britain, of society. While the countryside experienced economic stagnation due to falling agricultural prices, we noted this at the end of the previous video when we spoke about the onset of the Great Depression, which we'll get to in the next topic. We can see that the South remained a base for landed wealth and for political influence. The home counties, for example, around London, maintained their position as the centre of political power. More broadly then, of course, we're talking about Britain. We're not just talking about England, and so we have to think about Wales and Scotland. In Wales, the coal mining industry would begin to emerge as the major employer, while in Scotland, we see the rise of both textile manufacturing and shipbuilding, which is, of course, spurred by industrial growth. These areas, particularly in the north of England and the West Midlands, experienced economic hardship due to the limited access to global markets, as well as competition from emerging industrial powers. The emerging industrial powers being that of course, the United States on the one hand, and also Imperial Germany on the other hand. So while Britain's economic growth during this period did lead to prosperity for a great many within society, it also deepened poverty for even more people as the result. We see that economic disparities were visible across the social classes as well as across each of the different regions. So, for example, when thinking about prosperity in industry and commerce, or the wealth of these industries in industry and commerce, we can see that The wealth of industrialists, the urban middle class, and wages and living standards are three examples of how we can illustrate this point. So, for the first point, industrial entrepreneurs, particularly those who owned large factories and coal mines and railways and other major industries, enjoyed a great amount of wealth, as you can probably imagine. Many became part of this newly emerging industrial middle class, this new capitalist class, this new industrial bourgeois. And they wielded significant economic influence, but ever so slightly less political influence, of course, because that was held by the landed aristocracy still. The wealth generated by industrialization, then, allowed them to build large estates, to fund political movements, and to create powerful business empires. In addition, then, we can see that the urban middle class, many members from this part of society, prospered due to the growth of trade and commerce. This class benefited from the expanding market for consumer goods, as well as professional services and financial investments. So we see that bankers, investment bankers, professionals, and merchants all began to grow as the result of this ongoing impact of industrialization. We see that some segments of the working class, particularly those who were skilled traders or who just had better access to better paid industrial jobs, did see a rising of wages and an improvement in living standards. So it's not necessarily the case that everybody who was working class was limited in terms of the amount of wages or the living standards that they were experiencing. Those who were skilled traders would have a better opportunity in terms of wages and living standards, or just those who were lucky enough to have access to better paying industries. This created, though, a growing consumer class in cities, should I say, where the workers who were given a greater amount of living standards were able to afford more goods, such as clothing, furniture, and leisure activities. And so we see that rising out of the working class is also a new consumer class in the cities as well. Despite then the economic boom, we can see that many people in the working class still faced extreme poverty. Rapid growth of cities, as I've already mentioned, leads to poor housing and overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions. We see that workers lived in poor quality housing, often known as back-to-back terraced houses. You can sometimes see them, in fact, if you live in the north of England, if you live in some cities as well, you can see these buildings still exist, the back-to-back terraced houses. It's a legacy of this time period. They often had inadequate plumbing and sewage systems, and many urban areas, such as that of Manchester and Liverpool, were plagued by filthy, overcrowded slums where disease would spread rapidly due to this poor sanitation. Many factory workers, including women and children, as I've mentioned in previous slides, worked for between 12 and 16 hours a day, and this created a stark contrast between the industrial elite and the working poor. When thinking about the agricultural period of time, we know that the agricultural depression in the countryside caused many rural labourers to fall into poverty. The decline in agricultural profits, coupled with low wages and high rents, contributes to this widespread poverty in rural areas. And so we see that the tenant farmers struggled to make ends meet, and while many small landowners lost their land due to economic pressures, we see that this only gets worse when we think about the depression that we will get to in future videos.